The Maid'daughter waited outside a billionaire's mansion every night. The truth broke him. Damien Blackwood hated repetition. He hated repeated meetings, repeated excuses, repeated conversations, and especially repeated problems. In his world, problems were supposed to disappear after enough money was thrown at them. That was why the little girl standing outside his gate every night began to irritate him. The first time he noticed her, it was almost midnight. Rain streaked across the tinted windows of his black Bentley as the security gates of the Blackwood estate slowly opened. Damien barely looked up from the glowing screen of his phone until his driver quietly cleared his throat. "Sir." Damien's eyes lifted. A little girl stood beneath the street lamp across from the gate. She couldn't have been older than 8. Tiny, thin, wearing a faded yellow hoodie 2 sizes too big for her. Her sneakers were soaked from the rain, and her dark curls clung to the sides of her face. She stood perfectly still with her hands tucked into her sleeves. Watching the mansion, Damien frowned slightly. "Who was that?" The head of security looked through the windshield. "No idea, sir. She's been around a few nights this week, and nobody thought to mention it. She doesn't cause trouble, just stands there for a while and leaves." Damien's jaw tightened. People with money learned very quickly that strangers near their homes were never harmless until proven otherwise. "Call the police if she comes back," he said coldly. The Bentley rolled forward through the gates. But as the car passed, Damien glanced back once. The little girl wasn't staring at the mansion. She was staring at the front door, like she was waiting for someone. Inside, the estate was warm, silent, and enormous. Too enormous. The marble floors reflected the chandelier light perfectly. The fireplace crackled softly in the main hall. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock ticked with mechanical precision. Everything was expensive. Everything was empty. Damien removed his coat and handed it to a housekeeper passing by without really looking at her. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood," the woman said quietly. He walked toward his office before suddenly stopping. The voice, soft, familiar. He turned slightly. The housekeeper lowered her eyes immediately and continued folding towels near the staircase. Elena Rivera. She had worked in the mansion for almost 4 years. Damien knew almost nothing about her except that she was punctual, invisible, and somehow capable of keeping a 40-room mansion running without complaint. He looked at her for another second. Dark hair tied back neatly. Tired eyes. Simple gray uniform. Hands roughened from cleaning chemicals. Then, unexpectedly, he remembered the little girl outside. Same dark curls. Same eyes. The realization annoyed him more than it should have. The next night, she was back, standing beneath the same street lamp, waiting. Damien saw her this time from his office window on the second floor. He stood motionless, loosening his tie while the city lights glowed behind her small figure. "What is she doing?" he muttered. When he came downstairs an hour later, Elena was still working in the dining room polishing silverware alone. "Your daughter is outside again," Damien said abruptly. The spoon slipped from Elena's hand, just for a second. Then she quickly bent to pick it up. "I'm sorry, sir. You know she's there?" Elena looked embarrassed. "Yes." "Why?" "She waits for me after work." Damien stared at her. "You let an 8-year-old stand outside at midnight." Her face flushed immediately. "I told her not to come." "Then why does she?" Elena hesitated, and somehow that silence irritated him more than excuses would have. "Because she worries," Elena admitted softly. Damien let out a disbelieving breath. "About what?" Elena avoided his eyes while carefully stacking the silverware again. "We take the bus home after my shift. And the walk from the stop to our apartment," she paused. "It can be dangerous at night." Damien blinked once. Dangerous. The word sounded strange inside a mansion where every gate, camera, and lock cost more than most people's yearly salaries. "She waits outside because she thinks something might happen to you." Elena gave the smallest nod. "She says if she can see me leave the house safely, she can sleep." For some reason, the answer stayed in the room after she finished speaking. Damien suddenly became aware of the massive silence surrounding them. The polished floors, the echoing ceilings, the dining table large enough for 20 guests but almost always empty. Outside the windows, the little girl still stood beneath the street lamp, waiting for her mother. "You should have security walk you to your car," Damien said finally. "We don't have a car." Another silence. Damien hated silences that made him feel things unexpectedly. "I'll have someone drive you home tonight," he said shortly. Elena looked startled. Oh, that isn't necessary. It wasn't a request. She nodded quietly. Thank you, sir. Damien started to walk away. Then he stopped again. Why doesn't she wait inside? Elena's expression changed slightly. Almost ashamed. She says the mansion makes her nervous. Damien frowned. Nervous. Elena gave a sad little smile. She told me rich houses are too quiet. Something about those words unsettled him far more than they should have. Because deep down, he knew exactly what she meant. And upstairs, beyond the chandelier light and marble walls, Damien Blackwood suddenly realized that somewhere along the way, he had built himself a palace that even a child could feel was lonely. The next night, Damien Blackwood got home earlier than usual. Not because he wanted to. A merger meeting downtown had ended ahead of schedule after two executives spent an hour arguing over numbers Damien no longer cared enough to hear twice. Normally, he would have stayed at the office until midnight, drowning himself in contracts and conference calls just to avoid returning to the massive silent estate waiting for him on the hill. But at 9:15, his Bentley rolled through the gates. And she was already there. The little girl in the yellow hoodie, standing beneath the same flickering street lamp with both hands shoved into her sleeves against the cold. Waiting. Damien felt irritation rise again, though this time it carried something unfamiliar underneath it. Curiosity. Pull over, he said suddenly. The driver looked surprised. Sir, I said pull over. The car stopped near the sidewalk. Outside the gate. Rain from earlier still glistened on the pavement, reflecting the pale gold light from the mansion windows. For a second, the little girl looked ready to run. Damien noticed it immediately. Children didn't usually look frightened around rich people unless life had already taught them to be careful. He stepped out slowly, buttoning his coat against the wind. Up close, she looked even younger than he remembered. Small face, dark curls, huge brown eyes that watched him carefully like she was trying to decide whether adults were safe tonight. You're Elena's daughter, Damien said. The girl nodded once. Yes, sir. Her voice was tiny. What's your name? Sophie. Damien glanced toward the mansion. And every night you stand out here alone? Sophie looked down at her shoes. I'm not supposed to. Then why do it? She hesitated. Damien crossed his arms. Well, Sophie swallowed hard before answering. Because my mom gets off work late. I know that part. She has to walk from the bus stop. And Sophie looked toward the dark end of the street behind her. There's men sometimes. The answer landed heavier than he expected. Damien's expression tightened slightly. What kind of men? The little girl shrugged in the heartbreaking way children do when they've seen things they shouldn't fully understand. The loud kind. A cold breeze moved through the street. Somewhere farther downtown, a siren echoed faintly. Damien looked at her more carefully now. Her hoodie sleeves were damp. There was a small rip near one sneaker. And despite the cold, she was trying very hard not to shiver in front of him. You wait out here every night because you think your mother's in danger? Sophie nodded. If I see her leave the house okay, then I know she got through work safe. Damien stared at her. That answer did something strange to him. Because nobody had ever waited for him like that. Not when he was a child. Not now. His parents had raised him in houses larger than this one, filled with staff, chauffeurs, and expensive silence. When Damien stayed late at school, nobody stood by a window waiting anxiously for headlights. There was always someone paid to pick him up, but never someone afraid to lose him. You could wait inside the gate, Damien said quietly. Sophie shook her head immediately. No, sir. Why not? Her eyes lifted toward the mansion behind him. It's too fancy. That doesn't answer the question. She looked embarrassed now. Rich people don't like poor people sitting around their houses. Damien blinked once. Who told you that? Nobody. That means somebody did. Sophie stared at the sidewalk for a moment. Sometimes people look at my mom like they wish she'd disappear after she cleans stuff. The words hit harder than accusations would have, because they were spoken without anger. Just honesty. The kind children accidentally tell when they don't yet know adults spend most of their lives hiding uncomfortable truths. Damien looked toward the mansion windows glowing behind him. Then back at Sophie. How old are you? 8. You shouldn't be standing outside alone at night. I know. Then why keep doing it? This time Sophie answered immediately. Because if something happened to my mom and I stayed home, I'd never forgive myself. The sentence broke something open inside him. Not dramatically, quietly, like a crack spreading through glass. For a moment Damien couldn't speak. He suddenly imagined this tiny little girl sitting awake in a small apartment every night listening for footsteps that might never come home. Waiting, worrying, praying in the only way children know how. The mansion gates buzzed softly behind them as security shifted nearby, pretending not to stare. Damien cleared his throat. Come inside. Sophie's eyes widened. What? You can wait in the kitchen until your mother finishes. No, sir, I don't want to get her in trouble. You won't. She still looked uncertain. Damien realized then how deeply some people learned fear around wealth. Not fear of violence. Fear of humiliation. Fear of being unwanted somewhere beautiful. You're cold, he said firmly. And I'm not having a child standing outside my gate every night anymore. Sophie hesitated before finally nodding slowly. Inside the mansion, her sneakers squeaked softly against polished marble floors. She walked carefully, almost tiptoeing, like she was afraid touching expensive things might somehow break them. Damien noticed every second of it, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it made the giant house feel uglier than usual. In the kitchen, one of the cooks quietly offered Sophie hot chocolate. The little girl accepted it with both hands like someone handing her gold. Meanwhile, Damien stood near the doorway watching silently. You don't have kids, do you? The voice startled him. Elena stood there frozen beside the pantry entrance, staring at Sophie, sitting nervously at the counter. Damien loosened his tie slightly. No, Elena nodded once. I could tell. There wasn't cruelty in the statement, which somehow made it sting more. Then Sophie looked up at her mother with immediate relief flooding her face. And in that exact moment, Damien realized something deeply unsettling. Nobody had ever looked that relieved to see him walk through a door. Not once in his entire life. And upstairs, inside a mansion filled with priceless things, Damien Blackwood suddenly felt poorer than the people who cleaned it. The feeling stayed with him long after midnight. The next few days, Damien Blackwood found himself noticing things he had ignored for years. Not business numbers. Not market trends. People. It started with Elena. Before, she had blended into the mansion like wallpaper. Efficient, quiet, invisible. The kind of employee wealthy people praised specifically because they never disrupted anything. Now Damien noticed everything. The way she rubbed her wrist when she thought nobody was looking. The faint exhaustion beneath her makeup. How she quietly wrapped leftover bread from the kitchen in napkins before leaving at night. And once, something even smaller. At exactly 2 p.m., the staff usually rotated lunch breaks. Damien happened to walk through the downstairs service hallway after a conference call when he saw Elena standing near the coffee machine drinking water. Just water. No food. You skipped lunch, he said. Elena nearly jumped. Oh no, sir, I'm fine. That wasn't a question. She forced a polite smile. I ate earlier. But Damien saw the lie instantly. Not because he was good at reading people. Because Sophie was terrible at lying. And children usually learned honesty or dishonesty from the adults around them. That evening, Sophie sat at the giant kitchen island coloring with crayons one of the cooks had found for her. She had become strangely comfortable in the kitchen over the past week. Not the mansion itself, just the kitchen. The only place in the estate that felt warm enough to belong to actual human beings. Damien walked in while loosening his cufflinks. Sophie looked up immediately. You came home earlier today. The fact she noticed unsettled him. You keeping track of my schedule now? She shrugged casually. You look less tired before 9. One of the chefs snorted, trying not to laugh. Damien raised an eyebrow. Is that your professional medical opinion? No, Sophie continued, coloring seriously. You just walk slower when you're sad. The kitchen went quiet. Damien stared at her. Children really did say things adults spent fortunes avoiding. He poured himself coffee. And what exactly would I be sad about? Sophie glanced around the mansion kitchen. It's lonely here. Damien almost laughed. There are 15 people working in this house every day. That's not the same. The answer came instantly. Simple. Certain. She returned to coloring while Damien leaned against the counter studying her small face. You think this house is lonely? Sophie nodded. It's too quiet. Most people would love living somewhere this big. Maybe. She looked up again. But big doesn't always mean happy. Damien took a slow sip of coffee. He suddenly remembered being 10 years old in another giant mansion in Connecticut, eating dinner alone while his parents attended charity events downstairs. Nannies rotated through his childhood like temporary employees. Everything expensive, nothing warm. His jaw tightened slightly at the memory. You know, Sophie said carefully. Our apartment is really tiny. I gathered that. But sometimes me and my mom sit on the floor and eat grilled cheese sandwiches and watch old movies on her laptop. She smiled softly to herself. It feels bigger than this house. The words should not have bothered him this much, but they did. Because deep down, Damien knew exactly what she meant. The mansion had 32 rooms. Yet every night, he ate dinner alone in silence while televisions played financial news nobody watched. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, Elena and Sophie shared grilled cheese sandwiches and probably laughed more in 1 hour than he had all year. That realization followed him upstairs later that night. And for the first time in years, Damien didn't turn on the television in his bedroom. Instead, he stood near the window overlooking the city, watching lights flicker in distant apartment buildings. Thousands of tiny lives happening at once. Families arguing, children laughing, people waiting for each other to come home. His eyes drifted downward toward the staff parking area near the back gate. Elena exited the mansion wearing her thin coat, while Sophie walked beside her carrying a small paper bag from the kitchen. Then something happened Damien couldn't ignore. Elena suddenly stopped walking. Just for a second. One hand pressed subtly against the brick wall nearby, like she had gotten dizzy. Sophie looked up immediately. "Mom, I'm okay, sweetheart." But even from the second-floor window, Damien could tell she wasn't. Elena straightened too quickly afterward and forced a smile before continuing toward the bus stop. Damien frowned deeply. Something about the moment stayed with him long after they disappeared down the street. Because for the first time, he realized Sophie wasn't waiting outside the mansion every night because she was paranoid. She was waiting because she was scared. And Damien was beginning to understand she might have had a reason. The storm started just after sunset. Rain slammed against the mansion windows hard enough to shake the glass, while thunder rolled across the hills above the city. Most of the staff had already gone home early because of flood warnings downtown. But Elena stayed. Of course she did. Damien noticed immediately. At nearly 10:30 p.m., the mansion had become unusually quiet. No vacuum sounds. No distant dishes clinking. No soft footsteps moving through the endless hallways. Just rain. And Elena, still working. Damien walked downstairs after ending another frustrating business call and found her alone in the kitchen drying dishes beside the industrial sink. The sight irritated him for reasons he couldn't explain. "Why are you still here?" Elena looked startled. "I needed to finish inventory before tomorrow morning." "At this hour?" "I'm behind." Damien glanced toward the stack of supply papers beside her. "You're shaking." "I'm okay." "You keep saying that." For a second, something tired flickered across Elena's face. Not annoyance. Defeat. Damien leaned against the counter. "Where's Sophie?" "At our neighbor's apartment tonight." Elena forced a small smile. "She made me promise not to walk home alone in the storm." The image hit him unexpectedly hard. An 8-year-old worrying about her mother like a parent worried about a child. "You should have left hours ago," Damien muttered. "I can't afford to lose this job." The honesty in her voice made him look at her more carefully. Rainwater tapped heavily against the windows while Elena reached for another plate. Then suddenly, the dish slipped from her hand. It shattered across the floor. Elena swayed. One hand grabbed the counter. The other pressed against her stomach as her face lost all color. Damien straightened immediately. "Elena, I'm fine." But before she finished the sentence, her knees buckled. Damien caught her before she hit the marble floor. For one terrifying second, her body felt frighteningly light in his arms. Like someone surviving on exhaustion alone. "Call 911. Damien barked toward the hallway. 2 nearby kitchen staff rushed in immediately. Elena blinked weakly, trying to sit up. "No hospital," she whispered. "That's not your decision right now. Please," you collapsed. "I just need a minute." Damien's voice hardened. "You can barely stay conscious." But even then, Elena looked more afraid than sick. Not fear of dying. Fear of cost. Fear of consequences. Fear poor people learn young. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Rain poured over the driveway as paramedics loaded Elena inside. Damien stood beneath a black umbrella watching them work while lightning flashed across the sky. Then he heard tiny footsteps behind him. Sophie, one of the staff, must have called the neighbor. The little girl ran straight through the rain toward the ambulance, panic written across her face. "Mom!" Damien caught her before she slipped on the wet pavement. "She's okay," he said quickly. But Sophie's eyes were already filling with tears. You promised me, she whispered toward Elena through the open ambulance doors. You promised you'd be careful. The sentence nearly broke him, because it didn't sound like a child overreacting. It sounded rehearsed, like this fear had lived inside her for a long time. At the hospital, Damien waited longer than he intended to, longer than any billionaire with a calendar full of obligations should have. Yet somehow he couldn't leave. Sophie sat beside him in the emergency waiting room, curled beneath an oversized hospital blanket, silent, occasionally glancing toward the treatment doors. Finally, after almost an hour, a doctor approached. Family of Elena Rivera? Sophie immediately stood up. Damien rose beside her. The doctor looked exhausted. She's stable. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, low blood pressure, and prolonged stress. Damien frowned. Is there something else going on? The doctor hesitated carefully. She's been ignoring symptoms for a while. Sophie lowered her eyes instantly, like she already knew. She mentioned ongoing financial stress after her husband passed away 2 years ago. Damien blinked. Husband? The doctor nodded softly. Construction accident. The words hit like cold steel. Suddenly everything made horrifying sense. The extra shifts, the exhaustion, the fear. The little girl waiting outside at night, terrified of losing the only parent she had left. Damien slowly sat back down. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely ashamed. Because Elena had cleaned his home almost every day while silently carrying grief, debt, exhaustion, and responsibility alone. And he had never once bothered asking if she was okay. Beside him, Sophie quietly wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Then she whispered something so softly he almost missed it. She works too hard because she thinks if she stops, we lose everything. Damien looked at the child sitting under harsh hospital lights. Tiny hands, wet sneakers, fear too old for her age. And suddenly the billionaire who owned private jets, luxury towers, and half the city's skyline realized something devastating. There were people risking their health every single day just to survive inside the shadow of his wealth. And somewhere deep inside him, a part of Damien Blackwood began changing that night, though he still had no idea how painful that change was about to become. Elena stayed in the hospital for 3 days. 3 days Damien Blackwood told himself would not affect his routine. In 3 days he kept finding excuses to check on Sophie. The first morning after Elena collapsed, Damien walked into his kitchen expecting silence and coffee. Instead, he found Sophie sitting cross-legged on one of the oversized dining chairs, wearing headphones too big for her head, while coloring on a stack of printer paper. One of the cooks smiled awkwardly. She's been up since 6. Sophie looked up immediately. Your toaster talks. Damien blinked. My what? The toaster. She pointed seriously. It says good morning when the bread pops up. Damien stared at the expensive smart appliance across the counter. He had owned it for 2 years and never noticed. One of the chefs laughed under his breath. Sophie held up a crayon drawing. I drew your house. Damien took the paper carefully. The mansion stood in the center of the page beneath dark gray clouds. But what caught him off guard wasn't the drawing. It was the tiny yellow squares. Lights. Every single room had lights on. Yet there were no people in the windows. You forgot the staff, Damien said quietly. Sophie shook her head. No, I didn't. Her answer sat heavily in the kitchen. Children really did know how to find the truth hidden inside things adults stopped noticing. Later that afternoon, Damien drove Sophie to visit Elena at the hospital himself after her neighbor canceled unexpectedly. The little girl spent most of the ride staring out the Bentley's tinted windows at the city passing by. Finally she spoke. Do rich people ever get lonely? Damien kept his eyes on the road. What kind of question is that? A real one. He almost smiled despite himself. Yes. Sophie frowned slightly. But rich people can buy stuff whenever they're sad. That's not how loneliness works. Then how does it work? Damien went quiet for a moment. Nobody had asked him that in years. Truthfully, nobody asked him personal questions at all anymore. Employees feared him. Business partners performed around him. Women liked his lifestyle more than his company. But Sophie asked questions like she genuinely expected honest answers. It works, Damien said slowly. When you spend so much time building your life, you forget to actually live inside it. Sophie thought about that carefully. That sounds really bad. He laughed softly before he could stop himself. It is. At the hospital, Elena looked horrified seeing Damien carrying Sophie's backpack into the room. Sir, you didn't need to do all this. You've said that about everything. Elena flushed with embarrassment. Sophie immediately climbed onto the hospital bed beside her mother. You scared me. Elena kissed the top of her head gently. I know, baby. Damien turned slightly away, suddenly feeling like he was intruding on something private and sacred. Love without conditions. The kind he barely remembered existing. On the drive back to the mansion later that night, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat clutching her crayons. Damien carried her inside carefully so she wouldn't wake up. Halfway through the foyer, she shifted sleepily against his shoulder and murmured something barely audible. Don't leave the lights on tonight. Damien frowned slightly. What? Her eyes remained closed. Empty houses look sad with too many lights. Then she drifted back asleep. Damien stood frozen in the middle of the massive marble foyer. Above him, the chandelier glowed across polished floors and silent staircases. Too many lights. Too much space. Too little life. That night, for the first time in years, Damien walked room to room through the mansion, turning lights off manually. Guest rooms, formal dining halls, and used offices. Hallways nobody walked through anymore. One by one, darkness filled the estate. Strangely, it felt warmer. As he passed through the downstairs hallway near midnight, something taped to the staff bulletin board caught his eye. A child's drawing. Bright crayons. Stick figures smiling beneath terrible handwriting. One figure carried a tray. Another held gardening tools. At the top, Sophie had written, "For the people who make the house feel less empty." Damien stared at it longer than he should have. Then one of the older housekeepers passing nearby smiled softly. She's been leaving little notes for the staff. What kind of notes? The woman laughed quietly. Encouraging ones. Damien frowned. Why? The housekeeper looked genuinely surprised by the question. She says grown-ups look sad a lot. The answer hit him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Because Sophie was right. The mansion wasn't filled with cold people. It was filled with tired people. Lonely people. People carrying invisible things while pretending everything was fine. Including him. Damien looked back at the drawing on the wall, then toward the dark staircase leading upstairs. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't want to go back to the empty silence waiting in his bedroom. And deep down, Damien Blackwood was beginning to realize the little girl outside his gate hadn't just changed the atmosphere of his mansion. She was quietly changing him too. The frightening part was, he was starting to care enough to let it happen. By the time Elena returned to work, something inside the mansion had changed. The staff noticed it first. Damien Blackwood started saying good morning. Not every day, not perfectly, but enough to shock people. He stopped taking phone calls during dinner and began eating occasionally in the kitchen instead of alone in the formal dining room. Once, he even asked one of the cooks about her son's basketball game after overhearing a conversation days earlier. Small things, human things, and somehow, all of it traced back to an 8-year-old girl with crayons in her backpack. That afternoon, Sophie sat on the back patio wrapped in one of Elena's sweaters while drawing clouds across a sketchpad. The autumn wind moved softly through the estate gardens, carrying the smell of rain-soaked grass. Damien stepped outside holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Sophie smiled immediately. You remembered marshmallows. I'm learning. That's kind of scary. He laughed quietly and handed her the mug. The sound surprised both of them. For years, laughter inside the mansion had sounded unnatural. Forced during parties. Hollow during business dinners. Now it slipped out unexpectedly. Real. Sophie swung her legs beneath the patio chair. My mom says you work too much. Damien sat across from her. Your mom says that about everyone. She's usually right. He smirked faintly. You always defend her this hard? Yes. Why? Sophie looked genuinely confused by the question. Because she's my mom. Simple. Immediate. Like love should be. Damien stared down into his coffee for a second. Then Sophie tilted her head. Who defended you when you were little? The question caught him completely off guard. For a moment, he almost gave one of his polished billionaire answers. Something distant and clean. But somehow lying to Sophie felt impossible. Nobody, really. She frowned. What about your parents? Damien leaned back slowly in his chair while cold wind moved through the patio. My father cared more about work than people. Sophie listened carefully. And your mom? She liked appearances. He gave a dry smile. Everything had to look perfect. Sophie glanced back at the mansion behind them. That explains a lot. Damien actually laughed this time. You know, most adults are terrified to talk to me like that. Why? Because I'm rich. She thought about that seriously. That's a weird reason to be scared of somebody. It changes how people act. Do you like it? The answer came instantly. No, silence settled gently between them. Somewhere in the distance, birds rustled through the garden trees while evening sunlight stretched across the marble patio floors. Finally, Sophie spoke again. Were you lonely when you were a kid? Damien's chest tightened unexpectedly. Images flashed through his mind before he could stop them. Birthday parties organized by employees. Boarding schools. Cold handshakes from his father. Entire vacations spent surrounded by luxury and absolutely no warmth. Yes, he admitted quietly. Sophie lowered her hot chocolate. Then why do you make your house feel the same way? The question hit harder than anything anyone had ever said to him. Because she wasn't accusing him. She genuinely wanted to understand. Damien looked toward the mansion windows glowing gold in the late afternoon light. For years he believed success meant control. Perfect schedules. Perfect business deals. Perfect image. But somewhere along the way, he had recreated the exact emotional emptiness he hated growing up inside. And worse, he hadn't even noticed. I didn't mean to, he said finally. Sophie nodded slowly. I don't think people mean to become lonely. The sentence sat heavily in the air. Then footsteps approached behind them. Elena stepped onto the patio carrying folded towels from the laundry room. The moment she saw Damien and Sophie sitting together, surprise crossed her face again. Like she still couldn't fully process this strange friendship forming between her daughter and one of the wealthiest men in the country. You're supposed to be resting, Elena told Sophie gently. I am resting. You're interrogating Mr. Blackwood. Sophie grinned. He likes it. Damien raised an eyebrow. That's a strong word. But true. Elena shook her head with embarrassed amusement. And for one brief moment, Damien watched the two of them laughing together beneath the evening sky. Not polished. Not impressive. Not glamorous. Just real. The kind of warmth money could never manufacture. Then his phone buzzed. A business partner calling again. Damien stared at the screen for several seconds before silencing it completely. Elena noticed immediately. You don't have to ignore work because of us. Damien looked at the dark phone screen, then at Sophie smiling beside her mother. For the first time in years, work suddenly felt like the less important thing in front of him. That realization unsettled him more than any financial risk ever had. Because Damien Blackwood was beginning to understand something dangerous. The more attached he became to Elena and Sophie, the harder it would hurt if they ever walked out of his life. Damien noticed something was wrong the moment Elena stopped looking him in the eye. Not dramatically, quietly, the kind of change most people would never catch. But over the past few weeks, Damien had started paying attention to things beyond contracts and schedules. He noticed when Sophie became quieter during dinner. He noticed when one of the gardeners limped after long shifts. And now he noticed Elena suddenly becoming distant. Again, she had returned to calling him Mr. Blackwood, with sharp professionalism. Conversations became shorter. Her smile disappeared whenever he entered the room. At first, Damien told himself he was imagining it. Then he found the envelope. It sat neatly on his office desk one Thursday evening beside a stack of financial reports. His name written carefully across the front. The moment he opened it, his chest tightened. Resignation letter. For several seconds, the words didn't fully register. Damien reread the page once, then twice. Elena Rivera formally thanked him for employment opportunities and stated she would finish the month before leaving permanently. No explanation. No anger. Just distance. And somehow that hurt worse. Damien stood abruptly and headed downstairs. He found Elena in the library dusting shelves while soft jazz played through hidden ceiling speakers. You're quitting? Elena froze slightly before turning around. Yes. Why? She placed the duster down carefully. I think it's best. That's not an answer. Her expression remained calm, but Damien could see exhaustion underneath it. You've already done more for us than anyone ever has. That still doesn't explain why you're leaving. Elena hesitated, then finally said the thing she'd clearly been avoiding. Because Sophie is getting attached to this place. Damien frowned. And children shouldn't grow up confused about where they belong. The words landed heavily between them. She belongs with you, Damien said immediately. You know that's not what I mean. For the first time, frustration crept into Damien's voice. Then explain it to me. Elena looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. You've been kind to us. More kind than you realize. She swallowed softly. But eventually people like me always learn the same lesson around people like you. Damien's jaw tightened. What exactly is that supposed to mean? That none of this is permanent. Silence filled the room. Rain tapped softly against the tall library windows while the fire crackled quietly nearby. Elena folded her hands together carefully, like she hated every word coming out of her mouth. Sophie already talks about this house like it matters to her. She talks about you constantly. A sad smile crossed her face. And I can't let my daughter build emotional roots somewhere she could lose overnight. Damien stared at her. You think I'd throw you out? No, Elena shook her head immediately. I think life changes fast for rich people. Priorities change. Relationships change. One day you wake up and suddenly people like us no longer fit into the picture. The sentence hit painfully close to truths Damien spent years avoiding. Because his own parents treated people exactly that way. Disposable, replaceable, temporary. And deep down, he realized Elena had every reason to believe he might eventually become the same. I'm not them, he said quietly. Elena's eyes softened slightly. I know you want to believe that. The answer stung more than anger would have. Before Damien could respond, small footsteps echoed into the hallway. Sophie. She stopped instantly after sensing tension in the room. What happened? Neither adult answered right away. Then Sophie looked at the envelope still sitting in Damien's hand. Her face changed immediately. You're leaving? Elena crouched beside her gently. Baby, why? Because sometimes adults need to make difficult choices. Sophie's eyes began watering almost instantly. But I like it here. Elena brushed curls from her daughter's face. That's exactly the problem. The little girl looked completely lost now. Damien suddenly hated the situation more than he knew how to explain. Not because Elena was quitting. Because he finally understood something important. Helping people wasn't just about paying hospital bills or offering rides home. It was about trust. And trust terrified people who had spent years surviving disappointment, especially people who couldn't afford emotional mistakes. Sophie turned toward Damien quietly. You said lonely houses can change. The words hit him directly in the chest. Because he had said that. And now he realized Sophie believed him. Damien looked at Elena carefully, then at the frightened little girl beside her. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking realized he had absolutely no idea how to convince two vulnerable people that his care for them was real. Especially when part of him still feared they might be right to leave before he could hurt them accidentally. Then Sophie whispered something so quietly it nearly disappeared into the rain outside. If we go, the house is going to feel empty again. 3 days after Elena submitted her resignation letter, the first snowstorm of winter hit the city. The weather reports warned people to stay home after dark. Roads iced over quickly, buses shut down early, and freezing wind howled through the streets hard enough to rattle windows across the Blackwood estate. Inside the mansion, Damien stood near his office fireplace, pretending to focus on emails he hadn't actually read in 20 minutes. His eyes kept drifting toward the clock. 8:47 p.m. Elena should have left already. He finally grabbed his coat and headed downstairs. The kitchen staff were cleaning up dinner when he walked in. Where's Elena? One of the cooks looked confused. She left an hour ago, sir. Said she was trying to catch the last bus before the storm got worse. Damien frowned immediately. She left alone? Yes, sir. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not fear exactly. Something worse. Instinct. Before he could think further, the side entrance burst open. A freezing gust of wind swept into the kitchen. And there stood Sophie. Alone. Covered in snow. Damien's entire body went rigid. Sophie. The little girl looked terrified. I can't find my mom. Every person in the kitchen stopped moving. Snowflakes melted through Sophie's curls while her tiny hands shook violently from cold. Damien crossed the room instantly. What are you talking about? She didn't come home. Her voice cracked. The buses stopped, and our neighbor said maybe she got stuck here, but she's not here. Damien's stomach dropped. When did you leave your apartment? Sophie hesitated. I walked. The room went dead silent. You what? Tears spilled down her cheeks immediately. I didn't know what else to do. Damien felt genuine panic slam into him so fast, it almost made him dizzy. Their apartment was nearly 3 miles away. Through snow. At night. An 8-year-old had crossed half the city alone looking for her mother. Because she was afraid. Because adults kept failing to protect each other. Get towels. Damien snapped toward the staff. Someone rushed forward immediately while Damien crouched in front of Sophie. Listen to me carefully. You are safe now, okay? But my mom, we're gonna find her. For the first time in years, Damien didn't care about business meetings, appearances, or control. Only one thing mattered. Finding Elena. Fast. 20 minutes later, Damien's SUV pushed slowly through icy streets while snow hammered the windshield. Sophie sat in the passenger seat wrapped in blankets, clutching her mother's phone number scribbled on paper. No answer. Again and again. Damien tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Street after street blurred past beneath flashing emergency lights and freezing wind. Then Sophie suddenly pointed ahead. There. A city bus sat stranded near an intersection half buried in snow. Hazard lights blinking weakly. Damien pulled over immediately. He jumped out into knee-deep snow while freezing wine tore through his coat. Elena. No answer. Passengers huddled near the bus stop while emergency workers tried clearing the road. Then Damien saw her. Halfway down the sidewalk, helping an elderly man walk through the storm. Even now, even freezing and stranded herself, Elena had stopped to help somebody else. Mom. Elena turned instantly at Sophie's voice. Relief flooded her face so fast it looked painful. Sophie. She rushed forward through the snow and pulled her daughter into her arms. What were you thinking? I thought something happened to you. Elena looked horrified. You walked here alone? Sophie started crying harder. You didn't come home. Damien stood a few feet away watching them hold on to each other beneath swirling snow and city lights. And suddenly he realized something devastating. This wasn't just love. It was survival. They were all each other had. Elena looked up at Damien then, panic and gratitude mixing in her exhausted eyes. You found her. She came looking for you. Elena closed her eyes briefly like the realization physically hurt. Damien stepped closer. She crossed the city alone in a snowstorm because she was terrified of losing you. Elena's face crumpled slightly. For a second, nobody spoke. Snow fell quietly around them while traffic crawled through the frozen streets. Then Sophie whispered something against her mother's shoulder. I didn't want to be too late. The sentence shattered something inside Damien completely. Because suddenly he understood the real reason Sophie waited outside his mansion every night. Not paranoia. Not anxiety. Fear of abandonment. Fear life could steal the only person she trusted without warning. The same fear Damien himself had buried since childhood beneath money, power, and silence. And standing there in the freezing storm, watching that little girl cling to her mother like the world might disappear if she let go, Damien Blackwood realized he no longer wanted to be a temporary part of their lives. The terrifying truth was, he was beginning to feel like they had already become part of his. Winter passed slowly after the storm, but something inside the Blackwood estate never returned to the way it used to be. The silence changed first. Not completely. The mansion was still enormous, still filled with polished marble floors, towering windows, and rooms most people would only ever see in magazines. But now there was life inside it. Real life. Laughter from the kitchen. Music playing softly while staff worked. The smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings because Sophie convinced one of the chefs, breakfast tastes happier when it's round. Somehow, without anybody officially deciding it, the kitchen became the center of the house. Not Damien's office. Not the formal dining hall. The kitchen. And Damien found himself there more and more often. One morning, nearly 4 months after the snowstorm, he walked downstairs expecting coffee and quiet. Instead, he found Sophie sitting on the counter wearing fuzzy socks while explaining multiplication to one of the gardeners in dramatic detail. You can't panic every time numbers get bigger, she told him seriously. That's how math wins. The exhausted gardener laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. Damien shook his head. You terrorizing employees before sunrise now. Sophie grinned immediately. You were lonely before I got here. You needed entertainment. Elena looked up from the stove, trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile. For a moment, Damien simply stood there watching them. And once again, the realization hit him quietly. This was what home was supposed to feel like. Not perfect. Alive. A few weeks after the storm, Damien had made several changes at Blackwood Enterprises without announcing any of them publicly. Company transportation for late-night workers. Emergency childcare assistance. Expanded medical support for employees dealing with family crises. Quiet things. Human things. When his public relations director suggested turning the programs into a media campaign, Damien shut the idea down immediately. "These aren't advertisements," he said coldly. "They're responsibilities." And for the first time in his career, he actually meant it. One evening, Elena found him reviewing paperwork alone in the library. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. Damien looked up. "You keep saying that." Elena smiled faintly. "Because it's true." "No," he leaned back slowly. "What's true is that I spent most of my life believing success meant building walls high enough nobody could disappoint me." The fire crackled gently nearby. "And then your daughter started waiting outside my gate every night." Elena's eyes softened instantly. "She changed things. She exposed things." Elena looked down briefly. "You know, Sophie still thinks you saved us." Damien gave a quiet laugh. "She saved me first." The honesty in his voice filled the room with silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind people fall into when nobody feels the need to pretend anymore. Upstairs, faint footsteps raced down the hallway seconds later. Then Sophie burst into the library holding papers in both hands. "I finished it." Damien raised an eyebrow. "Finished what?" "My school essay." She ran over excitedly and shoved the paper toward him. At the top, written in messy pencil, the title read, "What Makes a House Feel Like Home?" Damien's chest tightened before he even started reading. Sophie climbed onto the couch beside him while Elena watched nervously from across the room. Damien read slowly. "A home is not the biggest place. It is the place where people wait for you to come back. It is where tired people laugh again. It is where lights stay on because somebody loves you. And sometimes homes can change when lonely people let each other in." Damien stopped reading for a moment. The room blurred slightly before he blinked hard. Sophie tilted her head. "You okay?" He looked at her. At Elena. At the warm library glowing softly against the winter night outside. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he truly was. Sophie smiled proudly. "The last sentence is the best part." Damien cleared his throat gently. "Yeah." She nodded, then pointed toward the mansion around them. "The house doesn't feel lonely anymore." And somehow, in the quiet warmth of that moment, Damien Blackwood realized the little girl who once stood outside his gates afraid of losing everything had unknowingly given him the one thing money never could, a reason to finally come home. This story reminds us that sometimes the people who change our lives the most are not the powerful ones, but the quiet souls standing unnoticed in the background. What touched me deeply about this story is how a little girl with no money, no status, and no influence was able to change the heart of a man who had everything except emotional connection. In today's world, many people are surrounded by luxury, followers, achievements, and success, yet they still feel emotionally empty inside. This story teaches us that human warmth, sincere care, and emotional presence are worth more than wealth itself. Sophie did not change Damien with money, pressure, or grand speeches. She changed him simply by caring about someone deeply and by showing him what genuine love looks like. That is something many adults forget while chasing success. One of the biggest lessons we can apply to our own lives is to pay more attention to the invisible struggles of people around us. Sometimes the strongest people are carrying the heaviest burdens silently. A coworker who smiles every day may be exhausted emotionally. A single parent may be fighting battles nobody sees. A child may be hiding fears they are too young to explain. We often become so busy with our own routines that we stop noticing human emotions around us. This story reminds us to slow down and truly see people again. Another powerful message is that love is often shown through small actions, not expensive gestures. Waiting for someone to come home safely. Asking if they ate. Listening carefully when they speak. Staying beside them during difficult moments. Those things may seem simple, but for many people, they mean everything. The story also teaches us that success without connection can become a very lonely experience. A beautiful house means nothing if nobody feels safe enough to laugh inside it. Real happiness comes from emotional security, trust, kindness, and having people who genuinely care whether you come home or not. I also believe this story encourages people to become softer in a world that constantly rewards coldness. Many people think vulnerability is weakness, but emotional honesty is actually courage. Damien's life only began changing when he stopped hiding behind power and allowed himself to care. Sometimes healing begins the moment we stop pretending we do not need others. Most importantly, this story carries an educational and human-centered message. Every person, regardless of status or income, deserves dignity, safety, and compassion. Small acts of empathy can completely change someone's life. If this story encourages even one person to become more patient, more loving, or more aware of the struggles around them, then it has already created something meaningful. As the writer of this content, I personally believe many people today are not truly suffering from lack of money, but from lack of emotional connection. I believe children often understand love more clearly than adults do. I believe kindness shown quietly is more powerful than kindness performed for attention. I believe lonely people sometimes build emotional walls so high that they forget how to let others care about them. I believe listening can heal wounds we cannot see. I believe many hardworking parents are carrying invisible pain every single day. I believe people should never be treated as disposable simply because they are poor or struggling. I believe a warm home is created by people, not luxury. I believe emotional safety is one of the greatest gifts we can offer another human being. And I believe stories like this matter because they remind us to become more human again. This story contains some creatively enhanced elements and the use of AI-assisted storytelling technology for entertainment purposes, while aiming to deliver meaningful, inspirational, and educational messages to the audience. Disclaimer: the content in this video is created for educational, inspirational, and entertainment purposes. Certain situations, dialogues, and dramatic elements may be adapted creatively to strengthen the emotional and moral message of the story.